I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to the elders past and present. I have to say, I think both of the speakers spoke quite well. Maher said his nightmare was coming into a public speaking event and showing up naked. My nightmare, besides my general nerves at speaking publicly, is speaking after someone like Randa, whose work I've admired for a very long time. So I hope people can lower their expectations for me a bit. In speaking today, I was asked to discuss why Australian journalists go on propaganda tours of Israel and don't look at the oppression of the Palestinians whilst they're there. For some journalists, the answer is straightforward. For whatever reason, they're ideologically sympathetic to Israel, and so they're eager to go on these trips to bolster their already existing worldviews. For example, take Shari Markson, who's currently a senior writer at The Australian. This is just one example to give you a sense of her worldview. She published on Twitter what she called a thoughtful question from a newsletter about Peter Slezak, spotted speaking at an anti-Israel rally wearing a Palestinian scarf. It claimed that Peter's parents are Catholic converts, he's not circumcised, had no bar mitzvah, so can we really say that he's Jewish? I just want to add, these are all lies. The response, which Markson also featured, expresses disgust at Peter, says that Peter reviles everything Jewish and is using his Jewishness as a weapon against Jews. So if that's the kind of thing that Markson thinks is thoughtful and that it impresses her outside of work, you can kind of figure out why she'd be happy to go on a propaganda tour of Israel. Now, Markson isn't the only person into this ideological category. In 2008, Greg Sheridan went on a trip to Israel, and he came back claiming that 1,500 Israelis were being killed every year by Palestinian terrorists. In fact, about 700 Israeli civilians had been killed in the previous 8 years. Still, the Jewish news was delighted by his performance. However, it's not just the true believers who go on these trips. Journalists across the media spectrum have signed up for them. Those who went last year include David Lipson, who's presently a political correspondent for ABC's Lateline, Alexander Hart from Channel 7, the deputy editor of the Daily Telegraph, the federal politics editor for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, and Aaron Patrick, who's the deputy editor of the print version of the Australian Financial Review. Why do they do it? Well, it's a free holiday. They get paid to see the world, they get wined and dined, they get treated like they're important. During his trip as a guest of AJAC, Patrick said the trips have, let's quote, attained almost legendary status in media circles. They flew business class, they went through the VIP lane at the airport, they had an armed driver, a full-time guide, experts were paid to brief them. They met with the Deputy Prime Minister of Israel, and most exciting, got to fly in light aircraft to the Golan Heights. He also met with a Palestinian who apparently offended his sensibilities by seeming Marxist. Patrick claimed that the reason they didn't cross into Gaza was because it was too dangerous, not because, as the UN Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process has said, no human being who visits Gaza can remain untouched by the terrible devastation there. Now, it's not just flattery and perks that get journalists on their propaganda tours. In my view, it's not hard to understand why so many journalists go on the trips, because there's nothing really anomalous about them. Journalists overwhelmingly don't cover oppression and discrimination in Palestine because they don't really cover those issues here either. Take the Northern Territory intervention in 2007. The federal government rolled out a raft of overtly racially discriminatory legislation and sent in the army. It got support across the mainstream political spectrum. There was no meaningful scrutiny from the media, and in fact, its strongest supporters came from the supposedly more highbrow news team at the ABC. 9 years later, $2 billion have been spent. The report on the sexual abuse of children that supposedly triggered the intervention lies forgotten, and so do its unimplemented recommendations. Almost 9 years later, there's zero accountability for these racist and failed policies, their architects, or their cheerleaders. Thus, it's too narrow to think of the propaganda tours as merely about ideology or free trips. they should be considered as reflective of a systemic problem. A helpful way to understand that problem is to apply the propaganda model developed by Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman in the 80s. They argue there are 5 news filters which the raw material of news must pass through, leaving only the cleansed residue fit to print. As I have limited time, I'll just discuss 4 of them. The first filter is ownership and profit orientation of the major mass media. In Australia, we have a very concentrated media. The print media is mostly divided between Fairfax and Murdoch. In 2011, Fairfax and Murdoch accounted for 86% of newspaper sales. In 2013, Murdoch papers accounted for 59% of sales of daily newspapers in Australia. That rises to 65% in capital city and daily papers. The concentration of media ownership influences coverage of Palestine in a few ways. Firstly, the Murdoch press, with all its influence, tends to slant in favor of Israel. For example, the Murdoch press has run obsessive campaigns against BDS activists and the Greens for their brief embrace of BDS, comparing them to Nazis and so on. There's another point to consider. Suppose you're a journalist. If you write about Israel too critically and you alienate the Murdoch press, you've shut yourself out of a lot of media jobs. In Australia, there already aren't that many media jobs to begin with. So for someone who needs to make a living, who doesn't want to close too many doors, there are strong incentives to be very careful in discussing Israel or avoiding it altogether. This applies also to the more highbrow progressive publications. Maury Schwartz publishes the monthly, the Saturday paper, and the quarterly essay. Their coverage of Israel and Palestine ranges from the non-existent to the derisive. I'll just cite one of the few articles they actually have run. It's from the Saturday paper, Nick Dyrenfirth discussing BDS. He began, as he would, with an account of his grandparents in Europe. They saw Nazi posters demanding that people not buy from Jews. Dyrenfirth ended by sadly observing Jake Lynch's utter incapacity to understand the descendants of those who lived through Nazi-era boycotts, and you can guess the rest. So why is their coverage of Palestine so lousy? John Van Tichelen, who used to edit the monthly, explained in a panel in 2014. He said that he worked very closely with the publisher because it's a small publication, and there were certain glass walls set up by the publisher that you can't go outside of. One of those is Palestine. The monthly is seen as left-wing, excuse me, but the publisher is very right-wing on Israel. He's very much to the Benjamin Netanyahu end of politics, so you can't touch it. Or take the largest commercial television network, Channel 7. It is owned by 7 West Media. SWM owns The West Australian, the only daily newspaper in Western Australia, along with Pacific Magazines, the second largest magazine publisher in Australia, 21 regional papers, 9 regional radio stations, and publishing business. SWM is chaired by Kerry Stokes, and its largest owner at 33.2% is 7 Group Holdings. SGH was formed by the merger of 7 Network Limited and Westrack. It is 67% owned by Stokes, and the punchline's coming. Westrack was known as Wigmore's until 1989, when it was bought by Stokes Company. And Westrack, for those who don't know, is the authorised dealer for Caterpillar in WA, New South Wales, and the ACT. Caterpillar makes Israel's bulldozers, used to demolish thousands of Palestinian homes in the occupied territories. In 2012, Westrack earned $387.1 million before interest and tax, whilst SGH's media investments generated less than a third of that, $116 million. So let me break that down. SGH is an enormous corporation, and part of its interests are in media, but it makes a lot more money from a business that is heavily implicated in Israeli war crimes. That gives Channel 7 and the West Australian and all the assorted radio, newspapers, and magazines enormous financial incentives to steer clear of any serious discussion of the occupation. Let's now turn to the second filter, advertising as the major source of revenue. Revenue for media companies has generally been declining in recent years, though Fairfax made a net profit of $27.4 million in the last half. It's generally been struggling. It recently announced it is cutting 120 jobs after cutting 1,800 in 2012. Bearing in mind that Fairfax is a vulnerable media company on the ropes, let's consider the war on Gaza in 2014. Mike Carlton wrote some critical comments about Israel bombing Gaza, and the cartoonist Glenn Livre portrayed a Jewish man with stereotypical features watching the bombing of Gaza. Fairfax apologized for the cartoon, and Carlton wound up resigning after being told to apologize to the readers he'd abused. That wasn't considered enough penance. The Jewish News reported that high-profile businessmen have said they will not advertise in the SMH. This is a quote from AbsDev Group Stephen Rom. He said, "We won't be supporting them with our dollars that we spend on advertising, and that runs into 7 figures." In recent years, Ruth Pollard, Fairfax's Middle East correspondent, produced increasingly courageous coverage of Palestine, such as her review of the Breaking the Silence report on the 2014 Gaza massacre. According to an unnamed source at Fairfax, they closed the Middle East Bureau in December last year. So she's basically been forced out, although it's possible she could have returned to not report on Palestine anymore. And I understand they have no plans to acquire a new correspondent. Given Fairfax's slim profit margins and their increasingly mercenary business model, I think that if they do get a new correspondent, they'll choose their new correspondent very, very carefully. The third filter, which I'll discuss more briefly, is sourcing. So suppose a news channel wants to interview someone about Israel and Palestine. They won't speak to an academic specialist on the Middle East, although if there's a terrorism angle, they'll probably consult Greg Barton. They won't speak to Palestinians in Australia, and they definitely won't consult Hamas on anything. However, every story has to have the Israeli government's version. Palestinians and their supporters are extreme, so they're excluded. The Israeli government, however, is balanced, and so are its domestic supporters, so they need to be cited. For domestic issues, a reaction will be sought from organizations like AJAC. Critics of Israel are usually not featured, as they're not part of the spectrum of respectable opinion. The most significant recent exception has been probably Bob Carr, but stories featuring him are balanced by a lot of demonization of him by the Israeli government lobbies and some of the Murdoch press. Fairfax has a tendency to abstain from discussing these issues. In the rare event that someone critical of Israel is allowed access to a large audience, there's usually demands for balance. The last filter I'll discuss is flack. Flack is backlash. It can come in the form of petitions, abuse, Nazi comparisons. In the case of one unfortunate target, complaints about breaching the RDA, the Racial Discrimination Act, attempts to fire Jake Lynch and to shut down CPACs. The goal of flack is to prevent critical coverage of certain issues. In the case of Palestine, the classic form is the charge of anti-Semitism. Even though I'm Jewish, I've been accused of anti-Semitism. Similar charges have been made against many others, including Anthony Lowenstein, Peter Slezak, John Docker, Jake Lynch, the Max Brenner picketers, John Pilger. I can really go on for hours. It's hard to overstate how glib and cynical these accusations can get. I'll just give one example. So Owen Jones wrote a column in The Guardian where he urged a vote for Labour in the UK. He included one reference to the establishment, including Rupert Murdoch and Goldman Sachs. The ICHAJ Public Affairs Director responded on Twitter, takeaway from Owen Jones' Guardian column. If you dislike Rupert Murdoch and bankers with Jewish names, vote Labour. So he actually thinks criticizing Goldman Sachs is a form of anti-Semitism. I'll spare you some of his wilder claims. The point of these smears is to bully people out of discussing Palestine. If criticizing Israel means that you'll have to deal with abuse and be called anti-Semitic, some people prefer to pick their battles elsewhere. There are plenty of less controversial issues in Australia which anyone can say, well, this is just as worthy of addressing. So those filters cause a systemic problem in Australian media coverage. That doesn't mean it's insurmountable. The quality of, for example, the quality of Australian correspondence has improved in recent years, like Sophie McNeil at the ABC or John Lyons at The Australian, who's now their associate editor. Like Bernard, I wanted to find something positive to end on. So what can be done for those who want better coverage of Palestine? I won't mention social media, but in terms of what else we can do, you can support independent media. You can say nice things to those who offer good coverage on the issues. You can complain at lousy media coverage and loudly judge those who spout Israeli propaganda and go on the propaganda trips. If those of us in the media get something wrong, tell us and demand better. We can get better coverage of Palestine if we want it. As Theodore Herzl reminds us, if you will it, it is no dream. Thank you.